All right. Hey now, everybody. We are back live. Excited to get a new podcast out. Welcome to a new Take Aim podcast. And Big Deer, Big Stories is what we do. Excited to have Cody Huhn back with us from Public Land Whitetails. You can check out Cody's channel on YouTube, Public Land Whitetails, same on Facebook as well. But excited to get with Cody, and we kind of really dive into multiple different situations on just improving our summer scouting and what summer scouting can do for us come hunting season and overall just for our overall success and what it means in just different situations throughout the summer on where we can find deer, where they could be, and so on and so on. And just an overall great episode. I guarantee you there is something in this episode that you can listen to and say, that talks to me in the situation I have going on right now. So as always, guys, hope you enjoy. It's a great episode. And as always, deer season never ends. We'll see you guys again next week. Also, guys, if you have not had the chance yet to check out Huntstand, highly recommend you do. Summer scouting season is here. We're getting on properties, visiting old properties. Make sure to check out some of the great information, like how to access property information and property boundaries, so on and so on. But there's so many great features on Huntstand. Make sure to take advantage of it during the summer scouting season. You can also use the code TAKEAIM10 for a discount on that today. All right, boys and girls, we are live. Excited to be back. I know it's been a minute. I took vacation and it kind of slow moving since I've been back, but excited to be back with Cody Huhn from Public Land Whitetails, and excited to that time of year. We're approaching June 1st, and Cody's going to help us out with some of the goals that we have improving our summer scouting game. So with that being said, man, excited to have Cody here. And Cody, what's happening?
Oh, just a bunch of e-scouting and personally putting boots on the ground myself, and I'm excited to be back here on the show with you and to talk about a lot of the, some arguably simple but very important tips and tricks I like to do for my personal summer scouting.
Yeah, for sure, and I think it's such a good time to do it. But I think a lot of guys, Cody, pick one or the other where they're like, I'm going to really do a lot of scouting after the season. We'll call it shed hunting or whatever. And sometimes there's guys that I think don't put enough value into summer scouting. So, with that being said, Cody, like, how much value do you put into it, and how much stock clout, when looking for new properties and e-scouting and all of that? Do you feel like majority of that work for you is done actually in the summer?
So I would say it's almost 50-50, honestly. There's I could argue a 60-40 case either way for fall or summer scouting, or I should say winter or summer scouting. But arguably I think it's 50-50, and what I mean by that is it really just depends on your specific environment. If you're in an area where the landscape and the terrain, and as in like human activity and other hunters, especially for public land, is constantly changing, that summer scouting can be next level for you, because everybody and their brother is out there for postseason scouting and shed hunting. Everybody is. But if you're out there summer scouting, a lot of guys I don't think put enough weight in how successful that is. And to a point, it can be very dry at times. You can go out there in the summer for velvet filming and see nothing. And at times you can go out there and see a field full of bucks. And then you're looking at that like, wow, these bucks are in this field, but we know they're not going to be in this field most likely come the fall. And that's where if you rework your thinking and you're not focused on necessarily that I want to hunt these locations when you're summer scouting versus maybe in the winter when you're doing the shed hunting and the winter scouting, these are areas that you pin drop specifically to hunt for next season. Flip that on its head a little bit and kind of do an opposite when you're looking at summer scouting locations. Not always. There are times where you can go into an area for summer scouting and, hey, this looks like a good area. I should hunt for this fall. But a lot of times, personally, when I look at these areas, I really get in there and I just see them for what they are, which is basically a collection of the population of your bucks. This is your time of year where you're going to get out there and take inventory of not only the bucks who made it through the season, the bucks that maybe you didn't know were even there, that you now have a chance to maybe velvet film or just lay eyes on. But also you're getting kind of an idea of your herd quality, your herd dynamic, your herd size, and all those play massive factors in the potential success of you and the tactics you should use come the fall. And just to briefly show an example, if you're going out there summer scouting and you're in an area that has no does or, very limited does, especially during a time where you should just see tons of does every day, then you know that come this fall, you need to change up how you're hunting, because you're going from a situation where maybe you're underpopulated in does or overpopulated in does, and that, without diving into that 3-4 hour spiel of how you should be hunting during those situations, the point is those are very, very different situations of how and why you should hunt and where you should hunt. And so, again, I think it's arguably 50-50 of why you should summer scout and also why you should shed hunt and do a lot of winter scouting, because it really goes into winter scouting is, hey, this area is good. Summer scouting is, now I'm getting information on the surrounding area and why that area was good in the fall, and maybe why deer were in there or in that area, or aspects of how maybe I can better access that area because of the herd or the bucks or just in general. And there's so much to go over, but that would be, I guess, my opening statement on. Most definitely, I would say they're pretty darn close to some are better in different places than others, and vice versa, but 50-50 for sure, probably.
Right. Yeah. It is, just as important. I feel like there can't be one without the other. But what I think you touched on just perfectly was saying it's dry. And sometimes I think guys go out with great intentions to summer scout, and then kind of see like, oh man, it's 80, I'm driving around, it's hot, I haven't seen a deer in 4 nights, so open the windows, we get swamped by mosquitoes, that type of deal. So,
yes.
And I think it turns guys off, and that's kind of the end of the summer scouting. But, I think there's a lot of good things besides that are, when you incorporate into summer scouting. So, Cody, let's talk about some of the properties that you kind of, are going to hunt this year, let's say, and basically where do you start with it? Do you go right to e-scouting and then merge that into boots on the ground, or vice versa?
Yeah, so to kind of, so we'll dive into that, and then also to kind of dive into a little bit of how I even get to that point. My main tactic for how I preferably like to summer scout is just start with e-scouting. E-scouting is a man's best friend in the modern world of hunting. And so really, I'm doing a ton of public land. And I do this when I help some guys or some of my clients on the private land side. I talk with them and whatnot and kind of figure out their land and I guess you could say. But with the aspect of public land especially, you start with e-scouting. You look at locations of areas that maybe you're interested in hunting, because e-scouting can be really, it can be a fantastic tool, but it's not everything at the end of the day. So for example, let's just drop a pin on this a bedding ground, or what you would assume would be a bedding ground on public land, and move on from there. So we're assuming that this is a location we're trying to hunt. Maybe you found a great spot while you were shed hunting. Well, now let's figure out why it's a great spot, and let's see what bucks are there. So we have this spot that you were shed hunting through, looked great, good sign, and now how I tend to approach it, pull up e-scouting, cover the area in potential other fall stands, pinch points, spots for bucks to move through. Now what I do is I basically just pull out I come out into a couple square mile view of the area from my main pin location, and I start just looking for food sources and summer food sources specifically. I like alfalfa in Michigan is a really solid food source to look at for the summertime. Beans in Iowa, bean fields are fantastic food sources to look at for summer scouting. You kind of just need to find what the deer in your area are really using for that summer food source, and get on it. And when you pull out and you find all those fields, usually, not always, but usually you can almost tie in to maybe where you're hunting a couple miles away, and maybe there's a big creek line that runs all the way back, or a big ridge line, or maybe a contiguous piece of a timber that comes all the way, and then it hits a spot where there's multiple fields that come off of these fingers or something like that. But you're always, no matter what, usually there's a pretty easy, even if it's just terrain-based. I mean, honestly, it can if you're in areas that are just farmland with small timber strips, or fence lines, anything like that, you get to these spots, you can just look at the terrain. And a lot of times, the bucks and does and just generally the deer will follow the terrain. And so if you can follow that terrain, you'll get to areas where these fields are, the areas that they tend to summer in. And at that point, I mark the field, get in my truck, and I drive out there, and I have 3-4 fields marked in the area with one specifically that I'm focused on. And I drive around and I start filming. I film, the deer that I find out there, and I usually go back a few times to the same location. So I hit every time a couple times, because you never know. There might be a night that a buck's not out there, but just doing that, at least I know when I get to that field and when I pull up and there's a good buck out there when I'm velvet filming. By doing that alone, that tells me that at least in this area, there's going to be a good buck. And kind of a perfect example of that was in Iowa last year when I was hunting a very specific public land piece. There's a lot of terrain, couple 100 feet in elevation, jump up and downs, multiple ridges, and everything around it was cattle pasture, and then a couple fields in a swamp. I mean, that was basically the terrain. This was the only reason this was public land was because it was unfarmable. So it had just been basically bought up by the DNR and left as this like 300-acre chunk right in the middle of, some farm, some cattle pasture, and some swamp areas. And so I had gone there to scout and found really good sign and heard some good things about that area. And that's why I had gone down into some of those ridges and for the preseason, and a lot of good sign in there. And so I decided I was going to come back and summer scout it. And that's what I did. And I come back in there and I drove around, and first day I didn't see anything. Okay, no big deal. And so I come back about a week later and I drove around and I saw maybe a buck that was about 130 inches. Whatever. Not huge for Iowa. Let me rephrase that. Not huge for Iowa, but okay, so we have some decent bucks in there. I come back about a week and a half later, and on the back end of this property, probably from the exact pin drop where I wanted to hunt, and where I did end up hunting last year, I would say a half a mile by the crow flies, there was a bean field. I had gone back there, and I pulled up there that night, right at last light, and I have tons of footage of this. I got to the field, and it was just covered in deer. Multiple bucks, multiple 120, 130s, and then there's a particular buck that I seen pop up over the ridge in the back of this field. Easy 150s. Okay, here's a target buck. This is great. Marked him, filmed him for a while, and, I drove off. And it was a 5-minute encounter. But that 5 minutes told me everything I needed to know about the potential of that area. Because now I knew there was an area that I had previously, was shed hunting in, and I could tell it was a good area in the fall. And now I have correlated that with a half a mile by the crow flies, that there's a buck in velvet over here who's 150 plus. He's 4+ years old. He's 150 plus, and half a mile. Now when I ended up coming back and hunting that, I very specifically hunted that buck for public land. And I think, I'm trying to remember the exact days, I believe it was November 17th and the 18th. I got photos of that buck a half a mile away in the exact spot that I had set up for him to just based off a sign, and a scrape that had opened up there. I got 2 photos of him, both daylight photos, moving through there. And I had one sighting with him late November sometime on the far eastern side of the property, up on another ridgeline. I ended up bumping him, actually walking into a spot I did not expect him to be in that location. He was in a very awkward location for that day, and I'm surprised he didn't bump sooner, because my wind was blowing right to him.
He was in there bedded?
Yeah, so he was in there. He was in there bedded. It was. I ended up parking my truck on a road and walking down this ridge line, and he was on the very point of this ridge, not even at the end where it drops, and there's a couple ridge fingers that come together. It gets real swampy, real thick in there, and a couple elevation dips. And he was on the furthest end of this, almost right tight to this cattle pasture, and that's why I didn't expect him to be there, because he was within 150 yards of a house, within 50 yards of this cattle pasture that had a ton of cows in it, and the farmer was always out there with his tractor. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take this ridge. It kind of swoops around. I'll park right off this road. I'm 300 yards from him, maybe 300 yards from the road from him. And it's a pretty wide open timber ridge. And so I parked, and I figured what I would do is I'd come down, I'd walk that end of that ridge down. When I got down to the end, I'd drop down a couple hundred feet in elevation and get down into one of these bigger bottoms that are a little bit marshy, and I'd catch him off of one of these middle ridges that I didn't expect him to be there, but I expected a mature buck to be on one of these more middle ridges a little bit deeper back in. Right. And what I ended up finding out is that nobody parks there, and nobody ever hunts that east end of that area. Wow. I found out after I bumped that buck, and I started kind of hunting that east end a little more, and I had to obviously approach it vastly differently. But once I was actually able to talk to the farmer, he's like, no, nobody ever parks in that parking lot. And that told me exactly why that buck was there, even though it wasn't the most ideal position for that buck. It was the ideal position for him just to be away from individuals. Right. And that were hunting him. And so, that was a failed hunt there, unfortunately. Even I learn every day. But that was probably about a quarter mile from that beanfield location. And so, a lot of guys, if let's say you had the ability to hunt that beanfield, or you had the ability to hunt that whole area, a lot of times some of the public land, the fields are right adjacent to it, or even the fields are public land. And so a lot of guys would have hunted the edge of that beanfield, and there was a big creek that ran down off of that into another timber lot that was actually right across the road, because that beanfield was across the road. And so a lot of guys would have hunted that section expecting that buck to be in there. And in my experience, you can really, if you find a buck in a field in the summertime, especially if you can get them in multiple different fields in that area, that you can almost just drop a pin, and you can go by the crow flies 2 miles, up to 2 miles out. Now, the further you go away, I would argue that you can start potentially maybe only getting nighttime encounters with these deer, and that's why a lot of guys, I think, get a lot of bucks at nighttime, is because they're cruising during the evening time, right, and whatnot. But if you can find these areas and that have good sign, and that's within a half a mile of an area or even a mile of an area that you then went summer scouting, driving around, found these bucks, I would argue that at least one time, you'll at least have one chance. One. And honestly, that's all you need. If you're really focused on that one deer and that's all you want, and you have maybe that's the only piece of property you have permission to hunt. It's only 20 acres. It's a really great sign, and there's a really big buck that you've seen in the summertime a half a mile away, a mile away. yeah, you might only have one chance, and unfortunately, that chance might be in the middle of the night, so it's not a chance anymore. But my point is that buck is almost guaranteed as long as you have that terrain, or the sign, I should say. The buck is almost guaranteed to be in that area at least once, if not more. They can just relocate completely, and so.
But in general, you're kind of in general saying from 1 to 2 miles, he's going to be in that area.
Yes, 100%, especially during the rut. During the rut, you're going to get bucks that 2 miles is easily 2 miles is realistic. And I know some people, especially when you're talking the older, more mature bucks, the 2 miles starts becoming almost fairy tale like, because that's a long ways for a mature buck to move. But I'm going to tell you, it can happen. I shot a really great buck in Michigan. He was 4+ years old. He was 100. I think he scored like 138. Unfortunately, the area that I hunted for years in Michigan just didn't have the genetics, or I guess you could say the food source, or a combination. But he was 4+ years old. 138-inch 10-point. That buck, I actually found out after I had killed that buck. I had never seen that buck. Not a single time had I ever seen that buck. I had no pictures of him. I didn't know he existed. I found out the end of that year that through a friend of mine, we got to talking. I showed him pictures of the buck. He ended up calling his father. His father called his uncle, and his uncle got in contact with me, and 2.5 miles away, as the crow flies, straight north of me, that guy had tons of photos of that buck. That buck was all over his property. He was everywhere in there. And for whatever reason, during the middle of the rut, that buck had adventured 2.5 miles away. He had stayed in my little 20-acre thicket that I had left alone, and I had caught him in the evening, the last 15 minutes of shooting light, heading back north on one of my blinds, and that was all I needed, was that one opportunity. So, I definitely would argue that if you see a buck, half a mile, 2 miles away in the summertime, I wouldn't say it's impossible for them to show up in areas, and even for public land. And so basically the easiest way, especially if you're hunting the public land, is just find the area that you're trying to hunt on public land from the winter scouting, the shed hunting, and then draw your circle for 2 miles. Go check all those fields. If you're getting bucks in those fields, great. That sounds like a good area. Maybe if you're only catching bucks way out on the fringes, then mark that spot as a potential spot to go and hunt, but don't make it your number one, and keep looking. I think that's the simplest way I can describe it, with as much detail, though, as to understanding why you should do, and everything, and also giving the point of it's entirely possible, and don't just, I really want to hunt this spot, but this buck is over a mile away at this field. I'll never have a hope. Never say never, because nothing is 100% in the hunting world. And
for every rule there's an exception, right?
Yeah. I
mean, there really
exactly
is. So, with that being said, Cody, let's talk about some of those exceptions for a moment when we're summer scouting. And I think some of it, generally speaking, is basically let's take the approach of don't put all your eggs in one basket, but it's more of collecting some of those eggs just to get information, right? It's kind of like we're taking a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and let's see what comes from it. But when you see those things, it's telling you, for whatever rhyme or reason, Cody, when you talk about that buck coming out to that field, what's the number one info that gave you? Like, they are living there for a reason, right? So at some point that there's a summer and fall range, but he's got to be comfortable getting from A to B. So like you said, I think that's a very crucial point you made about that living probably within a mile or two from where you saw them. And it just goes to show you that there's somewhere in there is a safety zone, and then it's kind of dissecting that.
Yeah, and that's actually, so that's perfect. You were hitting right on it. to elaborate a little bit of what I think you were saying there, getting A to B. That is, if you want to get more advanced to what I was basically saying of, okay, here's where this is good fall sign, here's where I seen the buck in the summer. If you draw points from A to B, from the fall sign to velvet filming him in the summer, look in that area from both those directions. How would you, as a mature buck trying to avoid hunters and people, how would you get from A to B the safest? And a lot of times there's terrain features, timber lines or swamps, areas maybe where people don't hunt, creek lines, river edges. I mean, just in general, those key terrain features can maybe determine, like, let's say you have a big piece of public land and the east end is closer toward where you velvet film this buck. A lot of guys might go over there and hunt the crap out of that end. But let's say maybe there's a big creek that wraps all the way up and around in the north, drops into a big CRP field, and touches the west end of this public land. And yes, don't get me wrong, that would take a buck a day and a half to move through, and so he's obviously going to have to stay over there for a day, and it's going to make him maybe on like a 3-day, 4-day pattern before he can come into this other section. But the point of that is you're going to take, if you're being hunted, you're going to take that extra day if it guarantees your safety, versus just running into an area that is not safe. And even though you're hunting a mile from as the crow flies from that spot where you velvet filmed him, and these other guys are hunting a quarter of a mile or a half a mile, I would argue you have a better opportunity at that buck because you're on a line of safety, a line of movement that significantly improves his chances of living. And that example was actually 100% of an example of a situation that I was hunting last year, and significantly seen more deer on the west end of that public land piece. And everybody tended to hunt the east end. There's a big drive up there. Everybody would drive up there. In the mornings getting in there, you could hear people driving their trucks on the gravel going up this ridge, going up into the public, and I could hear them clanking stands, and I would always hunt this west end, which you would think would be it was kind of a little bit more toward just some like generic cattle pastures. It wasn't as close to the food. There was only a couple ridges over there. It was a little bit harder to hunt. It just seemed like not the best area to be in, but I still had solid sign, and I believed it was sign in the day, daytime sign, and not evening sign. And I had so many good bucks, either moving through that CRP field or coming off of that creek line, and then coming toward me and moving down the ridge. And what I attributed that to was that CRP field was on that creek, and that creek actually wrapped up and around and went off into these big, a bunch of corn and bean fields up there. And everybody's trying to hunt as close as they can with the public when it wraps around up there, so that all these deer have to do is come across this one little timber line or this little 40-acre section of private. And I can understand that logic, but what they were really doing, what most of the more mature bucks were doing, was they were taking that extra day to move through that private area all the way down that creek line, staging up in that CRP, and then moving through that back end of that public. And I passed so many pretty great bucks in that area, or at least had good encounters with bucks that were borderline shooters, or one of them was, I would argue, was probably a shooter. He had a 160-inch right beam, and then his left beam, I don't know whatever happened, it was deformed, and it grew out, and then it just deformed and wasn't that great. And so he probably only scored 130, but he lost that 30 inches on the other side. And I actually ended up passing him. Late October, I passed him, and I was unsure if that was a good call or not. I'm happy with what I ended up turning out, with how my season turned out with, my almost 180-inch buck. But it was just the way that set up was illogical to humans, but logical to them. And that's really what you got to do, is you need to look at how the bucks are going to move to be safe. And without how that played out, it was a farther move for them, but it ended up being the safer move, and that's where I hunted. And because everybody else was trying to hunt as close to them as possible, I never had to encounter anybody else over there.
Yeah. And like you're saying, or kind of get back to what you were saying, the moral of the story is there was something in there that the rest of the guys couldn't see, and maybe you couldn't see from the road either, Cody, until you got in there. And then when you got in there, you're like, man, now I totally get it. These deer can move east to west, or west-east, or whichever way they were going, probably to food and bed, and they're hidden somewhere. They're hidden from the road. They're hidden from all the guys piling on that other side where they were hunting. And, whatever it was, the creek or the CRP or just the way the cattle pasture laid, there were some low bottoms in it or something that allowed those deer to get through there.
Yeah, exactly. And with that point too, like just finding areas of, if you could take anything out of that whole conversation we just had, hunt areas that have the least amount of pressure.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Find those areas, whether you got to cross a river, cross a creek, hike that extra mile. If you try not to break down the nitty gritty of what buck's moving where and why, just at the end of the day, if you're just trying to shoot bigger deer, just find the areas that people aren't. There you go.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, guys get, experienced or unexperienced will kind of tease you a little bit or trick your mind. And sometimes guys feel comfort in seeing like, oh, other guys have hunted here. There's got to be a reason, Well, some of that reason is it could be laziness. It could be this is 100 yards from the car. It could be all those factors involved, not necessarily what the deer are doing. It's more of what other humans are doing.
Yeah, for sure. And something to touch off of that too, there's definitely times where maybe a hunter keys in on a really good area and a bunch of guys flood in there, especially if you're, let's say you've been hunting an area for years and it's always been a great area for you. It's public land. And next thing you know, one year another guy shows up and next year now you have 3-4 guys in that area. Don't be afraid to move. And I know that area has been good to you, and that's fantastic. But that area is probably no longer going to be good anymore because multiple people are in there hunting it, and deer are dynamic. So just because don't look at it as this area is being ruined. Look at it as a new opportunity. And, maybe this area was always great. And even though you were successful in that area, maybe this area was hard to hunt. Maybe there's missed opportunities in there. Your wind wasn't always perfect. It was harder to access. Well, now with all these guys piling into this location that's now this primo spot, well, then bucks are going to have to go somewhere. And most likely, there's going to be a new primo spot. And if you've done your scouting, move to that secondary location that you marked and said, hey, this is a good spot. It's not as good as this. Move over there. Maybe that spot has completely 100% better access, and now every single mature buck that moves through there, you have the drop on. And all that's caused because these deer, the bucks are dynamic, and these other hunters were in your best spot. And a lot of guys would throw a fit and get upset and angry, and, oh, I got all these guys in my spot now, and they'd either just continue to hunt it out or maybe shoot the first 120 that walks by them because they don't think they can shoot anything bigger now because there's so many people in here. And I've seen that so many times. And
all right, guys, I'm going to cut this off right here. This will be part 1. I'll post part 2 in just a couple days. It's a long podcast and tons of information, so I just want to make sure we can capture it all and enjoy it to its full capacity because it's a great show. So, as always, deer season never ends. We'll see you guys again in a couple days.